My name is Sarah, and the day I turned 18 was supposed to be the day I left everything behind. The Riverside Children's Home had been my world for the past 14 years, ever since the accident that took our parents. My brother Danny was 16, still 2 years away from his own release date, and the thought of leaving him there alone made my stomach twist into knots every single morning leading up to that day. We'd been through everything together, survived things most kids couldn't even imagine, and now the system was telling me it was time to go out into a world I barely remembered, while he stayed behind those beige walls with their peeling paint and fluorescent lights that hummed like angry wasps. The morning of my 18th birthday started like any other. I woke up at 6:30 to the sound of Mrs. Patterson's heavy footsteps in the hallway, making her rounds to ensure all of us were awake for breakfast. The room I shared with 3 other girls smelled like cheap detergent and the lavender spray that Maria snuck in from somewhere, probably stolen from the dollar store on one of our supervised trips into town. I'd already packed my things the night before, just one duffel bag with clothes that didn't quite fit right and a few books I'd collected over the years. There wasn't much to show for nearly a decade and a half of living, but that's what happens when you grow up in a place that teaches you not to get attached to material things, because they can be taken away just as quickly as they're given. Danny was waiting for me in the cafeteria, sitting at our usual table by the window that overlooked the parking lot. He had dark circles under his eyes, and I knew immediately that he hadn't slept. My brother had always been the worrier between the two of us, the one who lay awake at night, thinking about all the things that could go wrong. When I sat down across from him, with my tray of rubbery eggs and toast that tasted like cardboard, he didn't even look up at first. He just kept stirring his orange juice with a spoon, watching the pulp swirl around in lazy circles, like he was trying to read his future in the bottom of a plastic cup. "I got something for you," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out an envelope, worn and yellowed with age, the edges soft like fabric from being handled too many times. "I found this in Mom's stuff, the box they gave us when we first got here. I've been holding on to it for the right time, and I guess today's that day." I took the envelope from him with shaking hands. I barely remembered our mother's face anymore, just flashes of blonde hair and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. But holding something she'd touched made her feel real again in a way that photographs never could. The envelope wasn't sealed, just tucked close, and when I opened it, a folded piece of paper fell out along with something else that clinked against my breakfast tray. It was a key, old and brass, attached to a leather cord that had darkened with age and wear. "What is this?" I asked, picking up the key and holding it up to the weak morning light coming through the cafeteria windows. It wasn't like any key I'd seen before, longer and more ornate, with a decorative head that had some kind of pattern etched into the metal. Danny leaned forward, and for the first time that morning, there was something other than sadness in his eyes. There was excitement, or maybe it was hope. I couldn't quite tell. "Read the paper," he said, nodding toward the folded document I'd set down next to my tray. "Mom left us something the social workers either didn't know about or didn't think was important enough to tell us." I unfolded the paper carefully, afraid it might crumble in my hands. It was a hand-drawn map, sketched in blue ink that had faded in some places but was still legible. At the top, in my mother's handwriting that I recognized from the birthday cards she'd saved in that box, were the words, "For Sarah and Danny, when you're ready." The map showed roads and landmarks, with notes written in the margins about distances and turn-offs. At the center of it all, marked with a star and circled 3 times, were the words Blackwood Farm, and an address in a town I'd never heard of called Millbrook Springs, about 200 miles north of where we were now. "I don't understand," I said, tracing the lines of the map with my finger. "What is Blackwood Farm? Why didn't anyone tell us about this?" Danny shrugged, but I could see he'd been thinking about this for a while, probably ever since he'd found the envelope. "I looked it up online when I could get access to the computer lab. It's an old property, hasn't been occupied in years according to the county records I could find. But here's the thing, Sarah. It's listed under our mother's maiden name, Blackwood. I think it belonged to our grandparents, maybe even before that. I think Mum wanted us to have it, but she died before she could make it official or tell anyone what she'd planned. My mind was racing, trying to process what this meant. We had a place, somewhere that belonged to us, to our family, not just a bed assigned by the state in a building full of other forgotten kids. I looked at Danny, really looked at him, and saw the same desperate hope reflected in his face that I felt blooming in my chest like wildflowers after rain. "We have to go there," I said, and it wasn't even a question. It was the most certain I'd felt about anything in my entire life. "I know," Danny replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I was hoping you'd say that, because, Sarah, I can't stay here for 2 more years knowing there's a place out there that's ours. I just can't do it. These walls, these rules, Mrs. Patterson breathing down our necks about curfew and chores, and being grateful for what we have when what we have is basically nothing. I'm suffocating here." I understood exactly what he meant, because I'd felt the same way every single day for years. The orphanage wasn't cruel, not in the obvious ways you see in movies. Nobody beat us or starved us or locked us in closets. But it was a place where you learned not to want things, not to dream too big, not to expect that life owed you anything more than basic survival. It was a place that prepared you to be grateful for scraps, and I'd watched too many kids leave those doors already defeated, already convinced that the best they could hope for was a small apartment and a job that paid just enough to keep them from being homeless. "So, what are you saying?" I asked, even though I already knew. "You want to leave with me today? Just walk out of here and not come back?" Danny nodded, and I could see his jaw set in that stubborn way he'd had since he was little, the same expression he wore when he'd gotten into fights with bigger kids who'd tried to take his lunch or mess with me. "I'm saying we take Mum's map, we get on a bus, and we go find out what she left for us. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just an empty building full of rats and broken windows. But at least it's ours, Sarah. At least it's something that belongs to us, and not to the state or to people who get paid to pretend they care about us." I should have told him no. I should have been the responsible older sister who reminded him that running away from the orphanage before he aged out could have consequences, that there were procedures and protocols, that we could get in trouble. But the truth was, I didn't want to be responsible. I didn't want to follow the rules anymore. I wanted to feel like my life was mine to choose, not something being decided by caseworkers and court orders and people who saw us as file numbers instead of human beings with dreams and fears and a history that mattered. "Okay," I said, and watched his whole face light up with relief. "We leave today, but we have to be smart about it. We can't just walk out the front door together because they'll know something's up. I'm already cleared to leave, so that's fine. But you need to make it look like a normal day. Go to your classes, do your chores, act like everything's fine. Then tonight, after bed check, you meet me at the old oak tree on the north side of the property. You know the one I mean?" Danny nodded quickly. The oak tree was a landmark for all of us at Riverside, a massive old thing that had probably been there for a century or more, with branches thick enough to climb and roots that had pushed up through the ground to create natural seats. It was just far enough from the main building that the security lights didn't quite reach it, and we'd spent countless summer evenings there over the years, talking about everything and nothing while the younger kids played kickball in the yard. The rest of the day passed in a blur of paperwork and forced goodbyes. Mrs. Patterson gave me a speech about making good choices and staying out of trouble, like she'd given every other 18-year-old who'd walked out those doors before me. The social worker, a tired-looking woman named Janet, who I'd met maybe 4 times in 14 years, handed me an envelope with information about job placement services and low-income housing applications. She asked me where I was planning to go, and I lied smoothly, telling her I had a friend from school whose family had offered to let me stay with them while I looked for work. She seemed relieved not to have to deal with another aging-out kid with nowhere to go, and she signed off on my exit paperwork without asking too many questions. By 6 o'clock that evening, I was officially free. I walked out the front door of Riverside Children's Home with my duffel bag over my shoulder and my mother's map and key tucked safely in the inside pocket of my jacket. I didn't look back, couldn't look back, because if I did, I might lose my nerve. Instead, I walked to the public library 3 blocks away, the one place I knew I could kill time without raising suspicion, and I sat in the reference section researching everything I could find about Millbrook Springs and Blackwood Farm. What I found was both encouraging and terrifying. Millbrook Springs was a small town, population barely 3,000, located in a rural part of the state known mostly for farmland and not much else. Blackwood Farm itself didn't show up in many records, but the few mentions I found indicated it had been a working dairy farm back in the 50s and 60s, before falling into disuse sometime in the 70s. There were a few grainy photos in an online historical archive showing a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a big red barn, and fields that stretched out toward tree-covered hills in the distance. It looked like something out of a postcard, the kind of place that probably didn't exist anymore, except in nostalgic memories and old photographs. The question that kept circling in my mind was why our mother had never told us about this place. Why had she left us a map instead of just taking us there when we were kids? What had happened between her and her family that made her stay away? And most importantly, what were we going to find when we got there? I tried not to let my imagination run wild with possibilities, but it was hard not to dream about having an actual home, a place with rooms that were ours, and a yard where we could sit outside without having to get permission or sign out on a clipboard. Hey, if you're watching this and finding yourself invested in Sarah and Danny's story, do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button right now. I post stories like this every week. Real tales about people finding their way through impossible situations, discovering family secrets, and fighting for what's rightfully theirs. And here's a question for you. Drop it in the comments below. If you found a map to a place your parents had kept secret your whole life, would you follow it? What would you hope to find there? I read every single comment, and I love hearing your thoughts and your own stories. Now let's get back to Sarah and Danny, because the night is about to get a whole lot more complicated. At 11:30 that night, I made my way back to the orphanage grounds, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The streets were quiet, just the occasional car passing by, and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the neighborhood. I kept to the shadows, moving carefully along the fence line until I reached the section where I knew there was a gap in the chain link, a spot where Danny and I and half the other kids at Riverside had snuck through over the years when we wanted to feel like we had some small piece of freedom. The gap was still there, hidden behind an overgrown lilac bush that smelled sweet even in the darkness, and I squeezed through without too much difficulty. The oak tree loomed ahead of me, its massive silhouette dark against the slightly lighter sky. I could see stars above, more than you could usually see in the city, and I took that as a good sign. Maybe we were meant to do this. Maybe Mom had left us that map knowing that someday we'd be brave enough or desperate enough to follow it. I settled down against the trunk of the tree, my duffel bag beside me, and I waited. Minutes felt like hours, and I kept checking the cheap digital watch I'd gotten from the donation bin, watching the glowing numbers tick forward with agonizing slowness. At 11:53, I heard footsteps, quick and light, and then Danny emerged from the darkness carrying a backpack that looked stuffed to bursting. He was breathing hard, his face flushed with adrenaline and fear and excitement all mixed together. "I thought I wasn't going to make it," he whispered, dropping down beside me. "Mr. Chen did a late round tonight, something about thinking he heard noise in the boys' wing. I had to wait for him to finish checking all the rooms before I could slip out." "You made it, that's what matters," I said, reaching over to squeeze his shoulder. "You got everything you need? Because we're not coming back for anything we forget." Danny nodded, patting his backpack. Clothes, my laptop chargers, all the money I'd saved from the work program. It's not much, maybe $230, but it's something. "What about you? How much do you have?" I pulled out the envelope Janet had given me earlier, the one with information I didn't need and hadn't asked for. Inside, clipped to a bunch of useless pamphlets, was a check for $500. It was the standard aging out payment, money the state gave every kid who reached 18 in the system, supposedly to help us get started in the real world. $500 to make up for 18 years of institutional living. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so insulting, but right now it was also our ticket to Millbrook Springs. 500, I told him, plus another 140 I had saved. So altogether, we've got about $870 to get us there and figure out what we're dealing with. It's not a fortune, but if we're careful, it should be enough to get us to the farm and keep us fed for a couple of weeks while we figure out our next move. We stayed under the oak tree for another few minutes, neither of us quite ready to take that final step that would make this real. Leaving the orphanage grounds meant we were really doing this, really choosing to walk away from the only stability we'd known for most of our lives. But as I sat there with my brother beside me and my mother's map in my pocket, I realized that stability was just another word for stagnation. We'd been stuck in place for so long, waiting for our lives to start, and now finally we had a chance to actually live instead of just exist. "Let's go," I said, standing up and brushing the dirt off my jeans. "We can catch the midnight bus from the downtown terminal. According to the schedule I looked up, it'll get us to Millbrook Springs by 9 tomorrow morning. From there, we'll have to figure out how to get to the actual farm, but we'll deal with that when we get there." Dean! The walk to the bus terminal took 40 minutes, and every time I heard a car behind us, I tensed up, half expecting it to be a police cruiser or someone from the orphanage who'd noticed Danny was missing. But nobody stopped us. Nobody even seemed to notice two teenagers walking through the city with backpacks in the middle of the night. We were invisible, just like we'd always been, except now that invisibility was working in our favor instead of against us. The bus terminal was one of those depressing places that exists in every city, full of fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered, plastic seats that were bolted to the floor, and the kind of people who had nowhere else to be at midnight on a Tuesday. We bought 2 tickets to Millbrook Springs from a clerk who looked like he'd stopped caring about anything years ago, and then we found seats in the corner where we could watch our bags and wait for the bus to board. "You scared?" Danny asked me, his voice quiet even though there was nobody near us. I thought about lying, about being the strong older sister who had everything figured out, but I was tired of pretending. "Terrified," I admitted. "I have no idea what we're going to find when we get there. The farm could be completely destroyed, or someone else could be living there, or it could be exactly what we're hoping for. I don't know which possibility scares me more, honestly." Danny nodded, understanding in a way that only someone who'd lived through the same things could understand. "At least we'll know, though. At least we won't spend the rest of our lives wondering what might have been out there. And Sarah, whatever we find, we're in it together. Just like always." The bus arrived at 12:45, 15 minutes late, and we climbed aboard with a handful of other passengers who all looked like they were running from something or toward something. Nobody just traveling for the fun of it. We found seats near the back, and I took the window so I could watch the city lights fade away as we headed north into the darkness. Danny fell asleep almost immediately, his head against the window and his backpack clutched in his lap, like someone might try to steal it if he let his guard down. I stayed awake, too wired to sleep, watching the landscape change from urban sprawl to suburbs to long stretches of empty highway bordered by fields and forests. I pulled out the map again, studying it under the weak overhead light. My mother's handwriting was neat and precise, the kind of writing that came from someone who took their time and cared about details. She'd marked rest stops along the route, noted which roads had the best views, even drawn little stars next to places she thought were worth stopping to see. It was like she'd planned this journey for us, imagined us taking this trip someday, and the thought made my chest ache with missing her in a way I hadn't let myself feel in years. There was a note at the bottom of the map, written in smaller letters, like she'd added it as an afterthought. "The farm is where I was happiest." I hope it can be the same for you both. Remember that home isn't just a place. It's the people who love you unconditionally. You are my home, and you always will be. Love, Mom." I read those words over and over until I had them memorized, until they were burned into my brain like a brand. She'd loved us. Whatever had happened, whatever had kept her from taking us to the farm when she was alive, it hadn't been because she didn't love us. And now we were going to see the place that had made her happiest. We were going to walk where she'd walked, and maybe understand a little better who she'd been before she became our mother. The sun was just starting to paint the eastern sky pink and gold when the bus pulled into Millbrook Springs. It wasn't really a terminal, just a covered bench on Main Street with a faded sign that said "Bus Stop" and a schedule posted behind scratched plexiglass. The town looked like something frozen in time, the kind of place where probably nothing had changed much in the last 50 years. There was a diner with a neon sign that said Rosie's, a hardware store with rocking chairs on the front porch, a post office that doubled as a general store, and not much else that I could see from where we stood on the sidewalk with our bags at our feet. Danny stretched and yawned, looking around with wide eyes. "This is it? This is the whole town?" "I think so," I said, pulling out the map again to orient myself. According to my mother's directions, we needed to head west on Route 47 for about 8 miles, then turn north on an unmarked dirt road that would lead us straight to the farm. 8 miles wasn't impossible to walk, but it would take us most of the morning, and we were both already tired from a night with no real sleep. "Let's see if we can find someone who might give us a ride, or maybe there's a taxi service or something." The diner seemed like our best bet for finding help, so we headed that way, pushing through the door to the sound of a bell jingling overhead. Inside, it smelled like coffee and bacon and maple syrup, and my stomach growled loudly enough that Danny laughed for the first time since we'd left the orphanage. There were maybe 6 or 7 people scattered among the booths and counter seats, all of them turning to look at us when we walked in, their faces showing the kind of curiosity small towns reserve for strangers who appear without warning. A woman, who must have been Rosie, based on the name embroidered on her apron, came over with a smile that reached her eyes. She was maybe 55 or 60, with grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of face that had seen a lot of life, but hadn't let it make her bitter. "Morning, kids. You two look like you could use some breakfast, and probably directions to somewhere, am I right?" "Yes, ma'am," I said, because there was something about her that made me want to be polite, to show that we weren't just random troublemakers passing through. "We're actually looking for a place called Blackwood Farm. Do you know it?" The change in Rosie's expression was subtle but immediate. Her smile didn't exactly fade, but it shifted into something more complicated, like she was trying to decide how much to tell us and what it might mean. "Blackwood Farm," she repeated, glancing over at an older man sitting at the counter who'd turned around on his stool to listen to our conversation. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. What's your business out there, if you don't mind my asking?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to these strangers. But something about Rosie's face, about the genuine concern I saw there, made me decide to trust her. It belonged to my mother's family. She passed away when we were kids, and we just found out about the farm. We came to see it, to find out what's left of it. The old man at the counter stood up and walked over to us, moving slowly like his joints hurt. He had a weathered face, the kind earned from decades of working outdoors, and eyes that were sharp despite his age. "Your mother wouldn't happen to have been Elizabeth Blackwood, would she? Went by Lizzie when she was young?" My heart started racing. "Yes, Elizabeth Blackwood. Did you know her?" The man nodded slowly, a sad smile crossing his face. "Knew her well. I'm Tom Harrison, used to own the property next to Blackwood Farm, back when it was still running. Your mother and I were in the same class at school, graduated together in '74. She was something special, your mum. Smart as a whip and stubborn as a mule when she set her mind to something. Broke a lot of hearts when she left town after high school." Danny and I exchanged glances, both of us hungry for any information about our mother. any glimpse into who she'd been before tragedy had shaped the rest of her life. "What happened?" Danny asked. "Why did she leave? Why didn't she ever come back?" Tom sighed and gestured for us to sit down in a nearby booth. Rosie brought over coffee for us without being asked, and I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, grateful for something to hold on to. "Your mother had dreams," Tom began, settling himself across from us. "She wanted to go to college, wanted to see the world beyond Millbrook Springs. Her parents, your grandparents, they were good people, but old-fashioned. They expected her to stay on the farm, to marry a local boy, to live the same life they'd lived. When Lizzie got accepted to a university downstate with a full scholarship, her father told her she couldn't go, said the farm needed her, that family came first, that education was wasted on a girl who was just going to end up married anyway." I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and fierce. "So she left anyway?" "She left anyway," Tom confirmed. "Packed a bag in the middle of the night and took the bus to the city, just like you two did, I'm guessing. She sent letters at first, trying to mend things, but her father was proud and stubborn. He refused to read them, refused to forgive her for what he saw as betrayal. By the time her mother convinced him to reach out, years had passed. Lizzie had graduated, gotten married, had you two. She wrote back saying she wanted to come visit, wanted to introduce you both to your grandparents, but then the accident happened. The weight of all those lost years, all those missed opportunities, settled over the table like fog. Our mother had tried to come back, had wanted us to know this place and these people, but time and circumstances and stubborn pride had gotten in the way." "What happened to our grandparents?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Your grandmother passed away about 12 years ago, cancer. Your grandfather followed her 6 months later, broken heart, according to Doc Matthews. The farm's been sitting empty ever since. There's no mortgage on it. Property taxes get paid automatically from an account your grandfather set up before he died. The lawyer in town, Steve Brennan, he's been managing it all this time, keeping the lights on, basically, waiting to see if any family would ever show up to claim it." "Muddy," Danny looked at me, and I saw hope blazing in his eyes like a fire that had just been fed fresh kindling. "So it's really ours. We can actually stay there." Tom smiled, and this time it was genuine and warm. "I expect that's exactly what your grandfather hoped for, even if he was too stubborn to say it while he was alive. He kept your mother's room exactly the way she left it, you know. Your grandmother used to go in there and sit sometimes, just being close to memories of her daughter. They never stopped loving her, even when they were too proud to tell her so, and I think they would have loved knowing that she had 2 kids who were brave enough to follow a map and find their way home." Rosie had been listening to the whole conversation, and now she pulled a cell phone out of her apron pocket. "Let me call Steve Brennan, get him down here to sort out the legalities. In the meantime, how about I make you two the best breakfast you've ever had? You're going to need your strength for what comes next. That farm's been sitting empty for over a decade, which means there's going to be work to do before it's properly livable again." While we waited for the lawyer and ate plates piled high with pancakes, eggs, bacon, and hash browns that tasted better than anything I could remember eating in years, Tom told us stories about our mother. How she'd been the fastest runner in the county, winning every race she entered at the summer fair. How she'd taught herself to play guitar by watching videos at the library because her parents couldn't afford lessons. How she'd stood up to the school bully who was picking on a kid with disabilities, earning herself a black eye and the respect of everyone who'd witnessed it. With every story, my mother became more real to me, less of a faded memory and more of a person I wished desperately I could have known as an adult. Steve Brennan arrived about an hour later, a man in his early 40s wearing jeans and a button-down shirt that suggested he was a small-town lawyer who didn't stand on ceremony. He carried a worn leather briefcase that had seen better days, and when Rosie introduced us, his handshake was firm and his smile was genuine. "I've been hoping someone would show up for that property," he said, sliding into the booth next to Tom. "Your grandfather made provisions in his will for any direct descendants of Elizabeth Blackwood. He never gave up hope that she'd come home, or that her children would. He pulled papers from his briefcase, spreading them across the table between our empty breakfast plates. The farm itself is 147 acres, including the main house, the barn, 2 smaller outbuildings, and a good amount of wooded land. Your grandfather paid off the mortgage in the 80s, and as Tom mentioned, there's an account that's been paying property taxes and basic utilities all these years. The house still has electricity and running water, though I can't vouch for the condition of the plumbing or anything else. Nobody's lived there since your grandfather passed. Danny was practically vibrating with excitement next to me, but I forced myself to stay calm, to ask the practical questions. What do we need to do to officially claim it? And what happens with Danny? He's only 16, still technically a ward of the state. Steve nodded, clearly having anticipated these questions. For you, Sarah, it's straightforward. You're 18, you're a direct descendant, and you have identification proving who you are. I'll need to file some paperwork with the county, but the property can be transferred into your name within a couple of weeks. For Danny, it's more complicated. Technically, he's supposed to be at Riverside until he ages out. However, if you're his legal guardian and you have a stable home to provide for him, we can petition the court for early release into your custody. How long would that take? I asked, my stomach knotting with worry. I hadn't thought this through completely, hadn't considered all the legal complications of taking my underage brother away from state custody. Could be a few weeks. Could be a few months, depending on how backed up the family court is, Steve admitted. In the meantime, Danny's presence here is a grey area. You didn't technically kidnap him since he left of his own accord, but the state will be looking for him once they realize he's gone. My advice? Let me make some calls today, start the process of filing for guardianship, and we'll see if we can work something out before anyone gets too upset about it. You've got a legitimate claim to the property and a good reason for wanting to keep your brother with you. Tom cleared his throat, drawing our attention. If it helps any, I can vouch for these kids being good people, known their family for decades, and I'm happy to testify that they're better off together on their own property than separated in the system. This town takes care of its own, and far as I'm concerned, they're Millbrook Springs people now. The kindness from these strangers, people who had no obligation to help us, made my eyes burn with tears I refused to let fall. Rosie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You're not alone anymore, honey. That's what you need to understand. You've got a whole town here that remembers your mother and wants to see her children succeed. We'll help you get that farm back into shape, help you navigate all the legal stuff, help you build a life here if that's what you want. After finishing up with Steve and promising to meet him at his office later that afternoon to sign initial paperwork, Tom offered to drive us out to the farm. His truck was old, but well-maintained, and Danny and I squeezed into the front seat beside him, our bags at our feet. The drive took about 20 minutes, following my mother's map almost exactly. We turned off the highway onto a dirt road that was overgrown with weeds, but still passable, and then suddenly there it was, appearing through a break in the trees like something out of a dream. Blackwood Farm was more beautiful than I could have imagined, even in its neglected state. The white farmhouse stood 2 stories tall, with that wraparound porch my mother had drawn on her map, though some of the boards were warped, and the paint was peeling in long strips. The red barn was still standing, massive and proud, though its doors hung crooked on their hinges. Fields stretched out in every direction, overgrown with wildflowers and tall grass that swayed in the breeze like ocean waves. In the distance, I could see the tree line where the woods began, dark and mysterious and full of possibilities. Tom put the truck in park and turned off the engine, letting us sit there in silence for a moment, taking it all in. Your grandparents built a good life here, he said softly. Raised dairy cows, sold milk and butter, kept chickens, grew vegetables. It was hard work, but honest work. The kind that lets you sleep well at night, knowing you've accomplished something real. Your mother grew up running through those fields, climbing trees in those woods, learning what it meant to be part of something bigger than yourself. I pulled out the brass key, the one that had been in the envelope with the map, and held it up to the light streaming through the truck's windshield. "Do you think it still works, after all these years?" "Only one way to find out," Tom said with a smile. The three of us climbed out of the truck and walked up the porch steps, which creaked under our weight but held firm. The front door was solid wood, weathered but sturdy, and when I slid the key into the lock, it turned smoothly like it had been waiting all this time for someone to come home. The door swung open, and we stepped inside into a world preserved in time. The house smelled musty from being closed up for so long, but underneath that was the scent of wood and old books and something floral that might have been sachets tucked into drawers. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners, but the furniture was all still there, solid and real. A living room with a stone fireplace and comfortable-looking chairs. A dining room with a table big enough for a family. A kitchen with vintage appliances that probably still worked if we could get them running. Tom showed us around, pointing out which pipes might need attention and which floorboards seemed soft, but I barely heard him. I was too overwhelmed by the feeling of standing in a place that belonged to us, that held the echoes of our family's history. Danny found the stairs and took them two at a time, and I heard him calling from the second floor. "Sarah, you have to see this!" I climbed the stairs and found him standing in a doorway, staring into a bedroom that was clearly the one Tom had mentioned, our mother's room. It was like a time capsule from the 70s, with posters of bands I'd never heard of on the walls. A bookshelf full of paperbacks with cracked spines. A desk with stacks of notebooks covered in our mother's handwriting. On the dresser were photographs, and I moved closer to study them. Our mother as a teenager, laughing with friends. Our mother on a horse, her face bright with joy. Our mother with her parents, our grandparents, all of them smiling at some long-ago family gathering. "She was happy here," Danny whispered, and I heard the wonder in his voice. This was her home, and now it's ours. We spent the rest of that day exploring every inch of the property, making lists of what needed fixing and what could wait, dreaming about how we'd make the place ours while honoring the history it held. Tom stayed with us until evening, showing us how to turn on the water and check the electrical panel, promising to come back the next day with some basic supplies and maybe a few neighbors who'd want to help. As the sun set over Blackwood Farm, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, Danny and I sat on the porch steps and watched the light fade over the fields. We didn't have much money. We didn't have jobs yet. We had a mountain of work ahead of us, and there were still legal battles to fight. But we had something we'd never had before. We had a home. We had a place where we belonged, where our family's roots ran deep into the soil, where our mother's memory lived in every room and every tree. "Do you think she knew?" Danny asked, leaning against my shoulder the way he used to when he was little and scared. "Do you think Mom knew we'd find our way here eventually?" I thought about the map, about the careful notes and the loving message at the bottom, about the key she'd kept safe all those years. "I think she always hoped we would," I said. "I think she wanted us to know where we came from, even if she couldn't take us there herself, and I think she'd be proud of us for being brave enough to follow her map." As darkness settled over the farm and stars began appearing in the clear country sky, brighter than any stars I'd ever seen from the city, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in 14 years, since the day we'd lost our parents and become orphans at the mercy of a system that didn't really care about us as individuals, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The journey had been hard, and there would be harder days ahead, but we'd made it home. We'd found the place our mother had wanted us to find, and in doing so, we'd found a piece of ourselves we hadn't even known was missing. The abandoned farm wasn't abandoned anymore. It was alive again, with possibility, with hope, with the promise of a future we'd build together on the foundation our family had laid generations before. And as I sat there on the porch with my brother beside me, and the night settling in around us like a warm blanket, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we'd face them the same way we'd faced everything else, together. If this story touched your heart, I'd love for you to subscribe to this channel. Every week, I share stories about people who refuse to give up, who find strength in the darkest moments, who discover that family and home aren't always what you expect them to be. This community is built on shared experiences and mutual support, and I'd be honored to have you as part of it. Drop a comment below and tell me your story. Have you ever discovered something about your family that changed everything? Have you ever had to be brave enough to leave behind everything you knew to find where you truly belonged? What did Sarah and Danny's journey teach you about the meaning of home? I read every comment, and I love learning from each of you. Remember, you're not alone in your struggles, and sometimes the family we need is the community we build together. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.